Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today's video is going to be all about whether or not Portuguese is a difficult language and how and why that might be the case. Before we get into today's video, if you're enjoying my videos and my channel and you'd like to support me, you can do so on Patreon. Patreon is basically a place where you can buy me a coffee each month, and in return you get exclusive extras. Those extras include things like knowing about what I'm working on next first, extra information and resources from the videos that I make about the Portuguese language, and just in general from my studies on the Portuguese language that I happen to find, as well as fun things like postcards directly from me to you. So if that sounds interesting to you, head on over to patreon.com/Slashinka where you can find out all of the details. Now, on with the video. The topic of today's video is one that comes up quite a lot from comments and questions that I get from native speakers, as well as second language learners of Portuguese alike. That, of course, is the idea that Portuguese is a difficult language, whether that is just a difficult language to speak in general, or a difficult language for non-native speakers to learn. I wanted to dedicate an entire video to this topic of language difficulty and whether or not Portuguese is an especially difficult language, because this is something that comes up rather frequently. This topic comes up quite a lot in messages that I get from second language learners of Portuguese who are wondering about the best strategies to go about learning Portuguese. I also often notice remarks from native Portuguese speakers who have the impression that Portuguese is especially difficult or complicated. And yet the concept of difficulty in language and language learning, and especially in linguistics, is not as well defined as it might seem. It can be said that each culture believes its language to be uniquely hard to learn for any number of reasons. Most often these reasons are tied to things like complex grammar, complex pronunciation, or a very large supposed vocabulary in the language. This is something that comes up especially in the context of language learning. Whether it be the learners themselves or native speakers talking about the language and trying to help out the language learners, the concept that a language is especially difficult is an easy thing to throw out as a way of justifying the complications that a second language learner can have when they're trying to speak the new language. But in order to define difficulty, we have to look at the main factors of what makes languages difficult in some capacity. Difficulty in language is inherently tied to our aptitude in language, or our ability to inherently understand the way languages work. But language difficulty is also something that is generally measured as a way of comparison between different languages. As a result, the second major factor on which we measure language difficulty is the context of the languages that we already speak. Some languages are going to be more difficult for speakers of any given language than certain other languages. This is true regardless of what languages you happen to speak. In this case, context matters. We have an inherent understanding of our native language. What that means is that all of the grammatical structures, vocabulary, and other workings of our languages are wired into our brain in a subconscious manner when it comes to our native languages. This affects the way that we use language and our tools available for processing it. It also means that languages that have similar structures are going to be naturally easier to learn than languages that are radically different. If you are a native speaker of a Romance language like French, you are going to have an easier time learning other Romance languages by virtue of the many similarities between those languages. The same can be said of any language family. Portuguese speakers generally have a very easy time adapting to languages like Spanish. Regardless of the levels that they ultimately achieve, it is easier and faster for them to adapt to these Romance languages than it would be for languages that are significantly different, such as Japanese or Arabic. This also applies the other way around. If you're learning Portuguese in Portugal, for example, most of your classmates are going to be Chinese. Native speakers of Cantonese or Mandarin are going to have an inherently more difficult time learning Portuguese than they would be learning a language more familiar to them. The overarching point here is that each language is part of a certain language family, and languages that are in the same family tend to be easier for native speakers to learn. But you will notice that we have not yet defined what difficulty actually is. And if we want to measure how difficult a language is in some capacity, whether that is to learn or just inherently, we have to define what difficulty really is. And this is where things get complicated. From a linguistic perspective, there is no such thing as just difficulty. In linguistics, all languages are treated roughly equally. They all have a similar level of difficulty because difficulty is not really a concept that is measured. Native speakers of English will in fact also find that there exists such a thing as a ranking of the difficulty of languages by the Foreign Service Institute. This famed ranking of languages places languages at levels from easiest to hardest, seemingly lending credence to the idea that some languages are just more difficult than others to learn. And yet this ranking still has its flaws. This ranking is in fact only really measuring the average number of hours that an English speaker needs in order to communicate and be communicated with in that language. From there, we can see that this is still context dependent. This is a ranking that takes into consideration only English native speakers, and some of its classifications can be seen as relatively arbitrary. When people are thinking of difficulty in languages, they are usually thinking of complicated grammar, complicated pronunciation, or a large vocabulary. And yet each of these factors alone doesn't necessarily constitute the whole picture of what would make a language difficult. This, of course, is because we have to ask ourselves in comparison to what? And that question is the most important question that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about whether a language is especially difficult. So to determine whether Portuguese is especially difficult, we have to ask ourselves questions like, do we already speak a Romance language, and are we naturally good with languages in general? Some people are simply more wired to process language and learn and adapt to new languages than other people are. Everybody has their skills and things that they're good at and things that they're not as good at, and for some people that's languages. But even when we take the three major complicating factors, grammar, pronunciation, or vocabulary, we still have to ask ourselves in relation to what? Are we comparing differences in syntax as being more or less complicated? Does the existence of cases and declension in a language make it more or less complicated to the ones that we already speak? These are not questions that have definitive answers. In the case of Portuguese, a case could be made for saying that its grammar is more complex in certain aspects than other Romance languages. Portuguese has preserved verbal tenses that no longer exist in other Romance languages, such as the future subjunctive. It could also be said that Portuguese is more complicated than other Romance languages because it has a greater inventory of sounds or phonemes, especially when it comes to vowels. But is Portuguese especially more complicated than Romanian, which has a similar vowel inventory to it, or Spanish, which has a very similar grammatical structure to it, lacking only the future subjunctive? I would argue that there is no definitive answer one way or another to that question. Because Portuguese can be compared in an essentially infinite number of ways to an essentially infinite number of languages, there is no definitive answer as to whether Portuguese is especially difficult. But the idea that Portuguese or any other language is the most difficult language to learn is simply a misnomer and a false concept, at least when it comes to linguistics. It could very well be that Portuguese is very difficult for some people who spend a lot of time trying to learn Portuguese without making that much progress. But that has more to do with that person than the language itself. Really, we have to flip the concept of difficulty around on itself and look at it from that perspective. But there's just one last thing that I need to touch on when talking about difficulty in language, and that is the size of vocabulary. Speakers of different languages love to talk about how big of a vocabulary their language inherently has because the dictionary registers hundreds of thousands, if not millions of entries. And I'm here to say that all modern major languages have a roughly similar vocabulary size. All modern major languages have adapted to the modern world and therefore adapted their vocabularies to being able to describe every single facet of that by virtue of necessity. There are smaller regional languages across the world that may in fact have smaller vocabularies because of certain cultural circumstances. But in the case of the major modern languages, that's simply not true. Claiming that a language has 400,000 or 200,000 or even a million words is simply a metric that is not capable of being accurate. These measures often extrapolate the number of lexical items either based on words that have been included in a dictionary already or based on simple mathematical estimate. The truth of the matter is that there is not a single simple or easy way to measure the number of words in use by any given language. Even the core vocabulary used in languages to express the most basic generalized concepts and to live day-to-day life is generally of a roughly similar size. Whether that fluctuates by a few hundred or a couple of thousand of words, from a lexical standpoint is fairly insignificant. Vocabulary as such is a poor measurement of whether or not a language can be considered difficult. So to go back to the main question of the video, is Portuguese difficult? The simple truth here is that there is no one clean, easy answer to that. That question is one that can only be answered on a personal level. And so the real question is, do you find Portuguese difficult? If you find Portuguese difficult for some reason, then Portuguese can be considered a difficult language. And as with a lot of things in life, we really shouldn't be talking about it in superlative terms. So that's all I've got for this video. I hope it helped you out in some way, whether that's answering your question about whether Portuguese is especially difficult to learn, in which case ask yourself, are you good at languages and do you speak a language that is similar to Portuguese already? Or whether you are a native speaker of Portuguese and just had a vague notion of Portuguese being especially difficult, in which case the question truly is compared to what and in what manner. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make lots of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.